The teller's name was Marlene. I'd known her 11 years, since the day I walked into that branch with a cashier's check from selling my hardware store, and she'd been the one to help me open the account. She called me Mr. Whitfield even after I told her 3 separate times to call me Gerald. On a Tuesday morning in November, I walked into Coastal Trust Bank on Ferry Street in Wilmington, North Carolina, at 9 to 20, approached her window, and asked to withdraw $4,000 from my personal savings account. Marlene smiled the way she always did. She asked for my ID. I handed it to her. She typed. She looked at the screen, and then her hands went still on the keyboard. Not the ordinary stillness of a woman finishing a transaction, the specific stillness of someone whose eyes have caught something her training tells her to handle carefully. She looked at that screen a beat longer than $4,000 required. Then she looked up at me, and her professional smile was still there, but it had stopped reaching the rest of her face. She said, "Mr. Whitfield, would you mind waiting just one moment?" She picked up the phone at her station. She turned her body a few degrees away from me and spoke low enough that I couldn't make out the words. She hung up and said, "Someone's going to come speak with you real quick, if that's all right." I said, "Marlene, what's going on?" She said, "Mr. Alvarez is going to come out. He's our branch manager. He'll explain everything." She said my name twice in under a minute. I've been in business long enough to know that's what people do when they're steering you gently toward bad news. I stepped aside and waited. Around me, the branch was doing its ordinary Tuesday business. A young couple at the next window arguing quietly about a car loan, a man in scrubs at the ATM, the ordinary machinery of an ordinary morning. About 40 seconds later, a door opened and a man in his early 50s, silver at the temples, wearing a navy suit that fit him like it had been chosen for exactly this kind of conversation, he walked toward me with his hand already extended. "Mr. Whitfield, I'm Danny Alvarez, branch manager. Could I get you to step back to my office for a few minutes?" I said, "Sure." I followed him down a short hallway to a corner office with a window overlooking the parking lot and 2 monitors on the desk, and a chair set up across from it, angled the way you angle a chair when you've done this exact conversation before and learned from it. He closed the door. He sat. He turned one of the monitors toward me slowly, the way a man turns a card he already knows is bad. He said, "Mr. Whitfield, before I tell you what's going on, I want you to see something. At 7:52 this morning, someone came into this branch and withdrew the full balance from your personal savings account. That was $31,110. He let that number sit in the room for a second. The withdrawal was made with a signed slip that appeared to carry your signature. Our fraud system flagged the transaction for review before it could fully process, and I pulled the security footage from this morning so you could see it yourself." He clicked his mouse. The monitor lit up with a camera feed, time-stamped 7 hours, 52 minutes, and 41 seconds in the corner, clear as a photograph, because this branch had been renovated the year before. A man stood at the teller window, medium build, ball cap pulled low, a jacket I recognized because I'd bought it for him myself 2 Christmases back at the outfitter store on Market Street. It was my son-in-law, Chase. I looked at that image longer than I needed to, long enough that Danny Alvarez had the decency to sit quiet and let me have the silence I needed. Then I said, real soft, "That's my daughter's husband, Chase Reddick," he said. "Yes, sir. The name on the withdrawal slip matched your name, but our system flagged an inconsistency in the signature pattern against your file, which is why we held the funds before final disbursement." I said, "He's not on that account. Never has been." Danny said, "No, sir. The account is solely in your name. What appears to be a forged authorization was presented this morning. We've placed the transaction on an internal fraud hold, which means the funds have not cleared out of the bank's custody yet. They're frozen where they sit." Frozen. I sat with that word a minute. I sat with everything underneath it, and everything I'd spent the last 3 weeks getting ready for finally clicking into the shape I'd known it would take. I said, "Danny, I appreciate how careful you've been with this. I need to ask you something. Is that money still recoverable?" He said. "The cash was physically disbursed to him this morning, Mr. Whitfield. But because of the fraud hold, he can't deposit it, wire it, or move it anywhere until this clears internal review. Effectively, it's frozen in place. If you file a police report today, and I'd strongly recommend you do, we can start formal recovery proceedings on our end." I said, "I'm going to need a full copy of everything, the transaction record, the withdrawal slip, and a printed still from that camera." He said, "I'll have all of it ready within the hour. I said, "Thank you." I sat back and looked at that frozen picture on the screen, my daughter's husband in his ball cap and his Christmas present jacket, standing at a teller window at 7:52 in the morning while I was 3 miles away pouring coffee, not knowing a thing. But here's what Chase didn't know. Here's the part that changes the shape of everything that comes before it. What Chase didn't know when he walked into Coastal Trust Bank that Tuesday morning was that 4 weeks earlier, I had quietly moved the overwhelming majority of my actual money to a different bank altogether. The $31,000 sitting in that account wasn't my real savings. It was the specific amount I had deliberately left behind in the account he'd had access to watch, because I had known for a full month exactly what he was building toward, and I had used that month to get ready for him. My name is Gerald Whitfield. I'm 66 years old. I live outside Wilmington, North Carolina, in a house I built with my own 2 hands starting in 1987, on a piece of land my wife Doreen and I bought back when this part of the coast was still mostly pine trees and nobody wanted it. I ran a hardware store on Oleander Drive for 34 years, Whitfield's Ace Hardware, before I sold the business and the building to a younger fellow named Marcus in 2022, and finally let myself slow down. Running a hardware store for 3 decades teaches you something that doesn't get talked about enough. It teaches you inventory. It teaches you that if a shelf is supposed to hold 40 boxes of 3/4-inch PVC couplers and it's holding 36, somebody either miscounted or somebody's been in the back room helping themselves, and your job is to find out which one it is before you decide how angry to be about it. I have spent my whole working life counting things and noticing when the count came up short. My son-in-law made the same mistake everyone eventually makes with a man like me. He assumed that because I was quiet and getting older and grieving my wife, I had stopped counting. I never stopped counting. Doreen passed in the spring of last year. A stroke, sudden, no warning at all. She'd been fine on a Thursday and gone by Sunday morning. And there is a particular kind of grief that comes from a loss, with no runway, no chance to say the things people imagine you get to say, and I'm not going to describe those first months because they belong to me and to her, and the description wouldn't serve what I'm telling you now. What matters is this. Doreen died in April, and by June, which is 8 weeks later, my daughter Kayla had asked me, on 3 separate occasions, how my will was set up and whether I'd thought about protecting the house now that Mama was gone. I had 2 children. My son Marcus, not the same Marcus who bought the store, different fellow, small town, common name is 36, lives up in Raleigh, teaches middle school science, calls me every single Sunday night without fail, and drove down twice in the first 2 months after Doreen died without me asking him to. He never once brought up money, or the house, or what I planned to do with either one. He's got his mother's instincts. He also told me, twice, quietly, that he was worried about his sister and thought I ought to keep my eyes open. I heard him say it. I didn't move fast enough on what he told me. Kayla was 39, married to Chase Reddick, living out in Leland with their 2 boys. Chase worked in the loan department at a regional bank branch across the river and had the specific manner of a man who has calculated the exact amount of charm a room requires and delivers precisely that much and not a hair more. He shook my hand firm at every family dinner, remembered which college football team I liked, asked after my knee, and in 11 years of marriage to my daughter, had never once said a single unrehearsed thing in front of me. Kayla was my daughter, and I loved her the way you love a child who made some choices you wouldn't have made for her, and who became somebody a little harder to sit across a table from than you'd hoped. She was smart and capable, and I'd watched those qualities pointed in a direction for years that I hadn't wanted to name out loud, because Doreen always said Kayla would find her own way eventually, and I'd let Doreen's read on people stand in for my own on that particular subject for longer than I should have. Doreen was gone, and Kayla started asking about the estate inside of 2 months. The questions came dressed up correctly. She'd mention a coworker whose father died without updating his will and the mess that followed. She'd mentioned that Chase had some background in this kind of thing through the bank and would be glad to look anything over if it'd help me out. She mentioned, once, that the land and the house were probably worth a good deal more than I realized in this market, and that it might be smart to understand the tax picture before I made any decisions. The land. The tax picture. I wrote every one of those conversations down in the ledger book I've kept since 1987, dated and summarized. The same way I logged every delivery discrepancy and every register shortfall for 34 years in that store, because writing things down isn't a hobby of mine. It's just how I'm built. By September, Kayla was asking about my online banking. She said she worried about me handling it all by myself. She said Chase had helped set his own parents up with automatic bill pay and it had made their lives so much simpler. She said she'd be glad to get it squared away for me if I just gave her my login. I told her I'd been banking online for 9 years without help and figured I could manage a while longer. She said she only wanted to help. I said I appreciated that. I wrote it down. In October, I came back from the feed store to find Kayla in my den. She had a reason. She said she was hunting for a photo album of her mama's she remembered from a box in the closet. That much was true. There were boxes in that closet. But when I walked in, Kayla wasn't over by the closet at all. She was at my desk, and she closed my laptop just a half second before I fully registered it had been open. I didn't say a word about it right then. I wrote it down after she left. And I spent the following week going through my finances the way I used to go through a supplier's invoice when the numbers didn't sit right. Every account, every statement, every login history I could pull. I found 2 things. The first was that my personal savings account had been logged into from an IP address that traced back to Leland at 3:14 in the morning on a night in August. 4 minutes. No transactions made. But somebody with my password had been in there at 3 in the morning from my daughter's part of town. The second thing was a soft inquiry on my credit report. I hadn't authorized a pre-qualification pull for a home equity line against my property, submitted online under my name back in July. It hadn't gone through, because I've kept a credit freeze on my file for years as a plain matter of habit, the same way I always kept the store's back door bolted even during business hours. But the inquiry sat there in July, right in the middle of Kayla, asking after my online banking. I sat at my kitchen table a long while, looking at those 2 things side by side. 34 years of running a small business teaches you what a real finding looks like, and it teaches you what it means when the numbers on the page stop agreeing with the story you're being told out loud. I'd been sitting on this particular pattern a good while, filing it away in the drawer where a man keeps things he isn't ready to call by their true name yet. I was ready now. The next morning I called a lawyer. Her name was Priscilla Odom, 61 years old, practiced elder law and estate litigation out of a modest office above a dry cleaner on Front Street, which I mention because there's something a modest office tells you about the kind of practice it is. And this one wasn't fancy, it was working. And I've always trusted the working kind more than the fancy kind. A fellow I used to buy inventory from had sent 2 people her way over the years for exactly this sort of trouble, and he'd described her the way one careful man describes another. Thorough. Doesn't like surprises. Neither do I. I walked into her office on a Monday at 8:30 with my ledger, a printed page summarizing the 2 findings, and my existing will, which had been drawn up in 2018 and never touched since Doreen passed. Priscilla went through everything without saying a word, the way the good ones do. No performance, no reaction for reaction's sake. When she finished, she set it all down and looked at me square. She said, "Mr. Whitfield, I want to ask you something plainly. Based on what's in front of me, do you believe your daughter's household is preparing to move against your estate?" I said, "I believe they've already started. That login and that inquiry don't happen by accident. That's reconnaissance." She said, "And your son?" I said, "Marcus warned me twice this past year. He's not part of whatever's happening here. I'd stake anything on that." She said, "What outcome do you want?" I said, "I want my estate to go where I decide it goes. I want them to understand eventually that I knew exactly what they were doing before they got far enough to do real damage. And I want a record, because I ran a business for 34 years, and the only thing that ever mattered in the end was the paper trail." Priscilla looked at me a moment. She said, "Those are things we can build. Let's talk about how." What Priscilla laid out, and what I carried out over the following 4 weeks with the same speed I used to reorder stock after a busy holiday season, went like this. I dissolved the old joint designations that still listed Doreen on 2 accounts. I set up a revocable trust, the Gerald T. Whitfield Family Trust, with Marcus named as successor trustee and sole beneficiary of the land and house. I moved the property itself into the trust. I opened a new primary account at a bank across town entirely, First Cape Fear Federal, under the trust, and moved the bulk of my actual money there. I left the Coastal Trust savings account open. I left it holding $31,110. I left it open on purpose, because I understood, with the same cold clarity I used to walk a stockroom floor with, that Kayla and Chase had my credentials and had been watching that balance climb for months. If I closed it or drained it all at once, they'd know something had shifted, and they'd change how they moved. If I left it sitting there looking like ordinary money, they'd see exactly what they were hunting for. I also called Coastal Trust directly and asked to speak to whoever handled fraud prevention. I got a woman named Ellen Marsh in their compliance office. I told her what I'd found and what I expected was coming. I gave her the account number and told her precisely what to watch for. I asked her to flag it for enhanced monitoring and to call me the moment anything moved. Ellen Marsh told me, "Mr. Whitfield, in 19 years doing this job, I believe I've gotten a call like this, maybe twice before." I asked her how those had turned out. She said, "Both times, in favor of the person who called." I said, "Good, that's the outcome I need." 4 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, I drove to Ferry Street to make a routine withdrawal, and Marlene's hands went still at her keyboard. I filed the police report that same afternoon at the New Hanover County Sheriff's Substation on Carolina Beach Road. The deputy who took it, a young man named Osei, wrote everything down careful and told me that given the dollar amount and the paper trail, this would go straight to their financial crimes unit. He kept copies of the security still, the forged withdrawal slip, and the full transaction record. The detective assigned was a woman named Renata Cole, mid-40s, sharp and unhurried, who called me the following Wednesday and asked me to come in with everything I had. I brought it all: the ledger with 14 months of dated entries, the printed login record from the August night, the credit bureau report with the July inquiry, a full account of the 4 weeks I'd spent restructuring the trust before the withdrawal ever happened, and one more document I'd put together over a weekend, a complete timeline of every conversation about money or the estate that Kayla and I had had from April of last year through November of this one, dated, summarized, and cross-checked against my own calendar. Detective Cole studied that timeline a good long while. She said, "You built this yourself, Mr. Whitfield?" I said, 34 years running a store. You learn that if you don't write it down the day it happens, you'll misremember it the day you need it." She said, "This login in August, you've got the bank's written confirmation on the IP location?" I said, "Yes, ma'am. Traces to Leland. Same general area as my daughter's house." She said, "And the credit inquiry in July, you've got the bureau report showing where the application originated?" I said, "I do." "Same regional footprint." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "Mr. Whitfield, between the bank footage, the forged authorization, the credit inquiry, and your own documentation of the account access, this is about as complete an evidentiary record as I've seen somebody bring in on their own," I said. "That was the point of doing it this way." She said, "Why not come to us back in August, first time you saw that login?" I said, "In August I had an oddity, a login from the wrong place at the wrong hour. An oddity's not a case. A case is what I had once. I had the withdrawal, the forged signature, and a full month behind it. I needed the whole shape of it before I moved," she said. "And now you've got the whole shape of it." I said, "Now I do." I called Marcus from the parking lot outside the sheriff's substation. He picked up on the second ring. I told him everything: the bank, Marlene, the security footage, the report I'd just filed. I told him about the August login, the July credit inquiry, and the 4 weeks I'd spent quietly moving my money before any of it happened. He stayed quiet through the whole thing. The particular kind of quiet a person goes when they're actually listening instead of waiting for their turn to talk. When I finished, he said, "Dad, how long have you known?" I said, "I've been keeping a written record since October of last year. I've known the shape of it since about then. I didn't tell you sooner because I didn't want you carrying something you couldn't do anything about." He was quiet another second. Then he said, "Are you all right?" I said, "I'm clear-headed. That's what I've got available to me right now." He said, "You want me to drive down?" I said, "Not yet. There'll be a point where I need you here and I'll tell you when we're at it." He said, "Okay. Then, Dad, Mama would have seen this coming a year before you did." I said, "I know it. She always read people faster than I ever could. Numbers I've got a handle on. People take me longer." I drove home. I sat on my back porch that afternoon and looked out at Doreen's roses along the side fence, which had gone a little wild the way a garden goes wild once the person who understood it isn't there tending it anymore. There was still good structure to it, because she'd built it right from the start, but the fine details of it were slipping at the edges, and I hadn't had the knowledge yet to hold them in place. I thought about the little spiral notebooks she'd kept in the shed, notes on every bed and every bush, and that evening I went and got them, and I sat reading her handwriting by the porch light for the better part of an hour. Following 3 seasons of a garden she'd never see finish blooming again, I went inside afterward and made myself dinner. I called Marcus back and we talked 40-some minutes about nothing in particular, and he didn't bring Kayla up again, and neither did I. Because everything left to say about it now belonged to a detective and a prosecutor and a timeline that had its own pace to it. The investigation ran 10 weeks. Detective Cole called me 3 separate times, and eventually an assistant district attorney named Wallace Pruitt got involved. Methodical, unhurried, the kind of man who reads through documentation the way it deserves to be read, slowly. What they eventually put together was this. Between April and November, Chase had accessed my banking credentials through the laptop in my den, most likely during one of Kayla's visits, confirmed later by the digital forensics on the login sessions. He'd used those credentials to track my balance for close to 5 months. He'd submitted the July home equity pre-qualification, which my credit freeze had stopped cold. He'd forged my signature on the November withdrawal slip and presented it at Coastal Trust, where Marlene's training kicked the fraud protocol into gear exactly the way it was supposed to. The forensic pull on Chase's phone, done under a warrant Detective Cole secured in December, turned up a running note he'd kept for months, tracking my account balance week by week. The last entry was timestamped 6:58 that Tuesday morning, 54 minutes before he walked through the doors of Coastal Trust. It read, "Balance this AM 31,110. Moving on it today." He'd been tracking it like a man watching a stock ticker. He'd picked a Tuesday he figured I had no reason to be near a bank, no appointments, nothing scheduled that would put me anywhere close to Ferry Street before he was long finished. He didn't know I'd put that appointment in my own calendar 3 weeks before he ever walked in. He didn't know I'd already asked Danny Alvarez to call me the second anything unusual touched that account. He didn't know about Ellen Marsh in compliance, or the enhanced monitoring flag, or the new account sitting quiet across town at First Cape Fear Federal, holding everything the Ferry Street account only appeared to hold. He'd spent 5 months watching a number on a screen and walked into a building to take it, never once suspecting the building was already waiting on him. Kayla, once the digital record of the texts between her and Chase surfaced, hired her own lawyer, separate from his, and gave a statement describing her involvement as general awareness of financial planning discussions, and expressed concern about how things had escalated beyond what she'd expected. Detective Cole told me about that statement with the particular dry patience of a woman who's heard general awareness phrased that exact way plenty of times before and has settled opinions about it. Chase was charged in February with financial exploitation of an elder adult, forgery, and obtaining property by false pretense. The case leaned on the security footage, the forensic trail on the credential access, the phone records, and that note from 6:58 in the morning. His attorney entered a not guilty plea. Trial was set for late spring. Neither of them called me between the November withdrawal and the February charges. I didn't call either of them. Marcus phoned every Sunday like always, and we talked about his students and the garden and a book he was reading, and mostly we left Kayla alone in those calls because there wasn't anything useful left to say about it that wasn't already moving through channels with their own timeline. I went back to see Priscilla in December after the charges came down, to make sure the trust was sitting the way it needed to. She confirmed it was clean, that the criminal case wouldn't touch the trust structure at all, and that the house and land were fully protected regardless of how the trial went. I asked, "And the 31,000? She said, "The bank's fraud recovery is moving. Given the frozen status and the strength of what you've got, Coastal Trust has indicated they expect to make you whole. Might take a couple months yet." I said, "I know it. I left that money in there understanding I might lose every dollar of it if that's what building the case cost me. I wasn't counting on getting it back. If I do, that's better than what I planned for." She looked at me a second. She said, "Most folks in your position don't think about it that way." I said, "Most folks in my position didn't spend 34 years running a hardware store." Chase pleaded guilty in April. The deal came with full restitution, a suspended sentence, 5 years of supervised probation, and a permanent mark on his record. Wallace Pruitt called after the plea and told me it was the strongest outcome the evidence supported. I told him I understood, and I thanked him for the work he'd put in. The restitution check cleared in June. I deposited it into the trust account at First Cape Fear and wrote the date down in my ledger, same as I'd written everything else down. Then I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and let myself sit with the fact that it was finished, which is a different kind of sitting than sitting in the middle of something and takes a while to get used to. Marcus drove down the weekend after the plea came through. We sat out back that Saturday afternoon and he helped me figure out one of the plants along Doreen's back fence I hadn't been able to place from her notebook alone. He knew, because she'd told him once and he'd held on to it. He said she planted that because the cardinals come through for it every winter. She told me the seed pods were made for a certain kind of bird. I said, I've been trying to work out what it needed. He said, less water than you'd think. She wrote it right there in the margin. We found the page later. She had. Less water than you'd think. That was Doreen exact. Even in the small print nobody else would ever read. We talked about Kayla once that afternoon, maybe 20 minutes, the way people talk about something that's settled but not entirely closed. Marcus asked how it had gotten this far, and I told him I figured the answer was the same answer. It usually comes down to that Chase believed I wasn't paying close enough attention for the plan to ever cost him anything. And that belief felt comfortable enough to him that the whole scheme turned real before he'd properly accounted for what a man who spent 34 years counting inventory actually notices. Marcus said, she should have known that about you. I said, she knew it plenty well 11 years ago. She just stopped keeping it current. He said, that's a real hardware store way to say it. I said, it's the only way I know how to say most things. The garden's coming along. Not what Doreen had it at, not her eye for it, but better than it was. I've been working through her notebooks page by page, learning what I should have learned while she was still here to show me firsthand. The fence planting put its seeds out that winter right on schedule, exactly like she'd written, and I watched from the kitchen window on 3 separate mornings as the cardinals she'd meant it for showed up and took them. She'd have been satisfied by that. Not surprised, just quietly satisfied. The particular way she got satisfied when something she'd planned out carefully went and worked exactly the way she'd figured. That's how she built that garden. She built it for the birds, and for the winter, and for whoever ended up standing at that kitchen window after she was gone. She built things, most of her life, not just for the moment she was in, but for whatever came after it. I built my own paper trail the same way. Not for the day I'd need it, but for the day after that, when having it in hand would be the difference between what was still possible for me and what wasn't. 34 years of a habit I built behind a hardware store counter, put to use on the most personal thing I've ever had to use it on. The record was the record, and at the end of it, that record was mine.